Martin Luther King Day was one of America's most contested holidays. It's hard to remember now, but this holiday faced perhaps the most heated adoption process of any holiday in American history. It was first proposed in Congress only days after King was assassinated on April 4, 1968. Black union leaders came together to support the holiday, highlighting how King had been killed while in Memphis to support a strike where black workers were fighting for equal treatment to their white counterparts. Long before the holiday was adopted in Washington, it was a staple of union bargaining contracts. King's birthday became a day of solidarity, a day of direct action. Unions, representatives, and King's living relatives at the King Center worked to popularize the campaign throughout the 70s and 80s. Coretta Scott King presented a petition with more than 6 million signatures in favor of the holiday to Congress, one of the largest petitions ever delivered to the Congress floor. Yet despite the popularity of the idea, it was strongly opposed in Congress. It was voted down over and over and over again. In the early 80s, 2 North Carolina Republicans actually filibustered the bill to create the holiday. One of them even brought the Red Scare back to Congress for a bit and produced a 300-page document about King's connections with communists. President Ronald Reagan was a bit shitty when the press asked about his own opinions of King, but when the bill did eventually pass Congress, he grudgingly signed it into law on November 3, 1983. He did this in part because his chief of staff thought this might help him solve his sensitivity gap when it came to minorities and women. Reagan knew he'd never get black people to vote for him, but he figured it might convince a few white moderates who wanted to like him but were worried he was a bit racist that everything was okay. But hey, the holiday was law now, nationally. That was a huge achievement. But even after it passed nationally, the holiday still had issues at the state level. In some states, Martin Luther King Day was known for years by blander names that specifically strip out King's legacy and the civil rights movement at large. Names like Human Rights Day. In Arizona, the holiday was contested for several years. A Republican governor said an executive order that the previous governor had passed enshrining the holiday in law was unconstitutional, and then made state employees vote for which other federal holiday to get rid of to keep MLK Day.
Blacks used to, first it was to be, they would call them colored, and then they wanted to be called Negroes, and now they want to be called blacks.
But fun fact, because there were multiple options, none were able to get over 50%, so none of them passed.
If a band of homosexuals and a few dissident Democrats can get me out of office, why heavens, the state deserves what else they can get.
Sometimes state legislators will try to get states to celebrate other people on Martin Luther King Day too. For example, there was a politician in Utah who thought that famous nonviolence proponent King should share his day with a Mormon weapons manufacturer from the 1800s, whose main claim to fame was inventing the gas-operated machine gun. This politician apparently saw these two men as complementary. And even now, some former Confederacy states pettily combine Martin Luther King Day with a celebration of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, which, honestly, it's hard to see that as anything but an enormous slap in the face. However, Martin Luther King Day is now generally widely acknowledged. Companies use it to promote their brands. Politicians usually give out at least a tweet of thanks. Government agencies who actively encouraged King to kill himself pretend they liked him all along.
I have heard the conclusions of your staff that it was a suicide urging. As I read it, I don't know what it means.
Side note here. In 1999, the King family filed a civil suit against the government for MLK's death, and a Memphis jury found that the local, state, and federal government were liable for his assassination. I've posted a link to the full trial notes in the description. Anyhow, some people even use Martin Luther King Day to promote issues that King himself would have despised and opposed with every goddamn fiber of his being.
He inspired us to change through the legislative process to become a more perfect union. That's exactly what President Trump is calling on the Congress to do.
Just... After everything activists fought for, after they tried so hard to make sure this day was enshrined in law, so Americans could take one day to remember the civil rights movement, the general way to celebrate this holiday seems to be to take a couple of King quotes out of context, say his message was about unity and love, and then promptly forget about it.
I can't take hate. It's too great a burden to bear. I'm going to stick with love. I think that is something that we should all say to ourselves. So please don't paint me just because I'm for border security that I somehow am racist in some way or another. I am John McCain's daughter.
It's clear that a little more remembrance of the actual life of King on the holiday named for him might be, shall we say, completely necessary. And despite the constant anger of right-winger types going on about SJWs indoctrinating our children, there really are not that many TV shows or movies that teach people about King's life, especially not ones targeted at kids. So in 1999, a group of people set out to make one. Our Friend Martin was released on January 12, 1999 by Disney subsidiary DIC Entertainment, which confusingly looks like a cheap knockoff of the company it's owned by. The stated goal of the movie was to reach kids and teach them about King's life. DIC CEO Andy Hayward described a conversation he'd had with his own children. They were studying it in school, and one of my kids came back to me and said, "Dad, there's so many mindless specials on the air, so many stupid things that mean nothing. Why has there never been a special celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday?" And I thought to myself, this is so obvious, why hasn't anybody done this? The goal was to create a special that could play on the holiday year after year. The movie was made with a cooperation of the King family and even features a few of King's children in voice acting roles. It combines some very 90s animation with archival footage from the 1960s. It had a soundtrack from Motown Records and a huge all-star cast, including James Earl Jones, Whoopi Goldberg, Danny Glover, Oprah, and Jaleel White, so you know it's the 90s. My favorite huge guest star is John Travolta, but as he shows up just to say like 2 lines as this kid's deadbeat dad.
I got better things to do than to drive you to school every stinking day.
Like everyone else has meaty roles or gets to play important historical figures. And here's Travolta as the guy who picks up his son high in his Trans Am every day.
Hey, Clueless! Let's move it! Don't make me get out of this truck!
I guess Travolta just wanted to be included. Our Friend Martin was nominated for an Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program and became a classroom staple. If you were in elementary school in the late 90s or early 2000s, there's a decent chance you watched this video in class. That's actually one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this movie. It's the first piece of media about the civil rights movement I consciously remember watching, and it shaped a lot of ideas I had about King for a long time. I think it's an interesting window into how we view King and how we treat historical figures in this country generally. So let's open up with a brief summary of the movie. We open on a flash forward of 2 kids talking about destiny. One of them walks into an empty doorframe that transforms into a large house around him. Electricity crackles, ominous noises are heard, and the other child bangs on the door of light and begs his friend to return. So we're starting off right with a bang. Credits roll and we cut to earlier. Miles is a very normal, very cool 90s kid, with a boombox and a giant brick computer and a fish tank. His mom is a successful business lady type, but Miles, like many cool 90s TV kids before him, doesn't like school. He'd rather be playing baseball.
You make sure you hit those books instead of hitting that baseball when you get home from school today. Understood?
But Mom, if I don't practice, how am I gonna grow up to hammer like Hank Aaron?
I'd honestly forgotten that baseball had a bit of a moment in the 90s, and then had a brief flash of unexpected sadness thinking about how that all came crashing down. Miles runs to school Ferris Bueller style to avoid a bully. This is also when the star of the movie gets his big moment.
Hey, Clueless!
In class, Miles learns that he's in danger of not passing 7th grade. His last chance to pass is a group project on Martin Luther King, with straight-A student Maria, bully Kyle, and his best friend Randy. Also, Randy loves skateboarding. He wears this skateboard on his back throughout the whole movie. I bring this up mainly because the way I was able to track this special down after years and years with no knowledge of its title was by Googling MLK plus skateboarding. Before going to the museum, Miles displays an upsetting lack of knowledge about Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King? What's there to know? He's famous for doing a bunch of good stuff for African Americans back in the day, and now we get his birthday off.
I feel like your teacher or your mom has probably told you about this, Miles. The class travels to the museum, which is in Martin Luther King's childhood home. There, they meet a cryptic museum curator who tells them that the house is magic.
You mean like Hocus Pocus? Pull a rabbit out of a hat magic?
No, nothing like that.
Miles tries to sneak into a room to play with Kane's old baseball glove, and the museum curator decides to teach him a lesson he'll never forget.
Every time I step into this room, something possesses me to wind this old watch.
The glove starts to crackle with magical electricity, and the two boys vanish. They reappear in a field and meet a kid named Martin. They realize that they've been transported to Martin Luther King's past. Miles immediately breaks the first rule of time travel and just starts spilling a bunch of information about the future.
This is Hank Aaron's number. In my book, he was the greatest slugger of all time. He hit more home runs than Babe Ruth.
They start playing baseball with Martin and some neighborhood kids before an angry mom arrives to take her sons home. She says some pretty openly racist stuff, and when confronted,
Miles and I are best friends. We hang out all the time.
Counters with this.
The only hanging you'll be doing with them is from a tree.
Yeah, this movie might have a lot of that 90s cheese, but it's pretty upfront about the violence black people faced. That's something I actually really respect about this movie. It doesn't shy away from the stakes of civil rights. They really wanted kids to engage with the realities of racial discrimination before the movement started. Martin teaches our heroes a lesson about not hating those who hate you, which I will talk about later.
The only cure for fear and hate is love.
We should love someone who hates us?
They then move through time again and see an older, Urkel-flavored Martin. Martin has wisely edited the memory of his two new friends vanishing into thin air out of his brain to preserve his own sanity, and doesn't remember them. They talk to him about his college plans and learn a lesson about segregation.
You best move to the other part of the dining car.
But I want to ride with my friends.
Suit yourself then.
Martin proves that he is probably too nice of a person and invites these two strangers to his house for dinner. There they meet his family, and his father, James Earl Jones, tells them all how important it is to help humanity.
A man has no greater purpose in life than to serve his fellow man.
These kids then rudely jump through time again without saying thank you for dinner, and land in 1956 in the middle of the bus boycotts. They meet Martin again, and this time they just flat out tell him that they're time traveling through his life, which feels like it breaks some kind of rule.
But we're sort of time traveling through your life.
Time traveling through my life?
Do you two want to break an important civil rights leader's brain? Kane then finds out his house has been bombed. As I said, this movie is really honest about the stakes of the movement. He finds out that his family is okay, and Samuel L. Jackson arrives, completely on brand as an action hero.
Well, if they want violence, we can give them violence. With guns and knives, bricks and bottles.
He gets this crowd going, but Martin talks again about meeting hate with love.
We must meet hate with love.
Actually, you know what? I was going to wait till the end, but I'm going to talk about this now. The movie, especially in this scene, puts forward the standard American view of Kane's nonviolent stance. The idea that Kane just sought to meet hate with love. Kane was indeed incredibly dedicated to the idea of nonviolence throughout his life. But this wasn't just due to ideals of peace and love, or because he loved his oppressors. Kane believed that nonviolent direct action was the most effective way for the oppressed to challenge their oppressors. It was strategic, and part of an active debate that many activists were having at the time.
If anyone has ever lived with a nonviolent movement in the South, from Montgomery on through the Freedom Rides and through the sit-in movement and the recent Birmingham movement, and see the reactions of many of the extremists and reactionaries in the white community, he wouldn't say that this movement makes, or this philosophy makes them comfortable.
The more standard view of Kane's nonviolent stance is usually well-intentioned, but it's also often used cynically by modern opponents of civil rights to undermine current movements like Black Lives Matter. And in reality, Kane's view on violence was a bit more subtle.
I think we do have to see that certain intolerable conditions existing in our society are responsible for these riots, and in the final analysis, progress and social justice are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
Anyways, back to the movie. The kids travel again and see protests in Birmingham that are met with police violence, both through archival footage and animation. Miles is understandably freaked out, but they grab a newspaper and get transported back to the present. They return to their class with way more information about the civil rights movement, which makes Maria, who knows these two are generally kind of dumb, suspicious. Also, the fact that they're in the documentary that the teacher shows to the class is a pretty big red flag that something's going on. So later, when Miles and Randy go back to the museum for another jaunt through history, Maria grabs Kyle and follows them. They admit to what happened, but Maria is skeptical.
Time travel? You guys are beyond loco.
She then proves that she is the coolest person in the room.
Talk to the hand, Kyle.
Miles and Randy prove that they really can travel through time.
No, Biggie. It's time travel time.
Randy, you're breaking the laws of time and space. I think this is a little big. They land at the March on Washington, where poor Kyle immediately loses his shirt and embarrassingly has to live through a major historical event looking kind of douchey. The kids listen to Kane give his speech. Then they meet their teacher in the past and learn she used to be a hippie.
Hi, I'm Joyce, but that's so old. I'm changing my name to...
Sunshine?
Sunshine, yeah.
They go back to the present and start to head home, but then learn that Dr. Kane was assassinated. Again, I have no idea how they don't know about this already, given that they apparently live in his hometown and their high school is named for him, but whatever, I'll give this one to you, movie. They all then just throw every time travel rule out the window and agree to bring Martin from the past to the future to save his life. They go back to young Martin at the baseball field, convincing him to join them on a trip through time. The trip to the future seems choppier than normal, and when Miles and Martin arrive, they arrive in a horrible alternate reality. None of their friends know who they are and are openly racist. The museum is just an old, burned-down house. The school is segregated and named after Robert E. Lee. Apparently, feminism never happened.
You're stupid, woman.
Miles's mom works as a maid, and Miles has lost all of his cool stuff.
My stereo and my computer and my video games and everything.
Our heroes are reflecting sadly on the hell world they find themselves in. But then...
Always remember, a man has no greater purpose
than to serve his fellow man.
James Earl Jones appears to Martin, on brand as a wise sky dad. And Martin realizes this has all happened because he left the past. Because he needs to go back and become who he's supposed to be.
You mean all the good you did in the 50s and 60s? The marches, the boycotts? Doesn't exist anymore?
Maybe the work I was supposed to do never happened. Because I wasn't there to do it.
But how can one person's life cause so much change?
What matters is that you're not afraid to make a difference. Miles, we all have a destiny in life. This is mine.
He enters the doorframe, and Miles, while begging him to return, sees a vision of his death.
Wait, please, Martin!
The world turns back to normal.
You know who I am? The biggest butthead in 6th grade as usual.
Miles goes back to his class, and the near destruction of his timeline was all worth it because he gets to advance to the next grade. Now Miles can move into middle school after having seen horrific racial violence, psychically witnessing a murder across time and space, and knowing that if circumstances were just a little bit different, his best friend in the world would be a racist who actively hates him. They all paint a mural and it's a happy ending. Hooray! There are some really good things about this piece. For example, I love the combination of archival footage and animation. I think it gives the movie a really interesting connection to the history, and is a great way to remind kids, hey, this was a thing that really happened, without showing them a documentary. It also, at times, just looks really cool. I also really like how this movie doesn't gloss over the violence people faced during the civil rights movement. The filmmakers and the Kane family talked about how they really wanted to walk the fine line of not being too upsetting for younger kids, but being honest about the history and about what people were facing. And I think they really knocked that out of the park. And this movie is actually pretty good about getting you to empathize with the characters. Like, I wasn't expecting to feel feelings during a 90s kids instructional film, But Miles here was getting to me, especially in the end of the movie. He seems like a good kid who deserves good things. Like, probably a best friend better than Randy. Randy, who is a racist in an alternate timeline and who disrespects Miles' favorite sport by cheating with his dumb skateboard. That said, I do think this movie has some real issues that reflect larger issues with the way we talk about the civil rights movement and the way we talk about historical figures in our country generally. For example, in Miles' modern time, we see almost no hint of racism. For example, Kyle is bullying him not because of race, but because he's a bully in a 90s cartoon, and that's what bullies in 90s cartoons do.
The biggest butthead in 6th grade as usual.
The only indication we get that racism even still exists in Miles' modern world are a couple of throwaway lines.
Get real! When you're living in color, sports and entertainment are the only sure bets for making the big time.
Well, I'll tell that to General Colin Powell.
Oof, in hindsight, you probably should have chosen a different example.
But racism was still very, very present in the 90s. At the end of the movie, the mysterious museum curator says that
people still have problems getting along, but it's much better today because of Martin Luther King Jr.
But that kind of minimizes the enormity of the problem of racism in America.
And that's when the whole country realized the laws were wrong and had to change.
But the whole country didn't realize that. Lots of Americans remained committed, and still remain committed, to racial segregation. And honestly, it's a little depressing that the hell world Miles visits is one where black families have trouble getting ahead economically, where women and Latinx people are treated like garbage, where the school is named after Robert E. Lee, and where white teenagers are racist. These are all still things, is what I'm saying. But it's hard to fault our friend Martin specifically for this, because this was a very 90s thing. The idea that we as a nation were moving past racism, despite literally all evidence to the contrary, was everywhere. Painting a rainbow mural to represent racial harmony is honestly the most 90s thing I can possibly imagine. Also, racial harmony in the present does heighten the contrast between Miles' life and the other timeline, so it does make sense from a story standpoint. But it also gives the impression that racism is something that's been largely solved. The King family was very aware of this issue when they were interviewed about the film. They all knew America had a long way to go.
This movie also tends to overfocus on the early part of King's career. The last several years of King's life are left out. They stopped traveling through his past pretty much right after the March on Washington. After the Civil Rights Act was passed and legal segregation was ended, King started focusing on other structural systems that kept racism in place.
The real estate agent said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have anything listed." Now you can find something somewhere else, and it was always back in the ghetto, but they didn't have anything. And then soon after that, we sent some of our fine white staff members into those same real estate offices, and the minute the white persons got in, they opened the book. "Oh yes, well we have several things. Now what exactly do you want?"
In his later career, King started to talk more about things like the importance of housing, the prevalence of poverty in America, his opposition to the Vietnam War, and America's obsession with the military, as well as democratic socialism. A lot of these positions remain radical today, and these problems have by no means been solved. King's vision, his dream, has not been achieved yet. Like, one thing that really blew me away when I was researching this video was learning that during the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966, one of King's demands to Chicago Mayor Daley was the creation of a Citizens Review Board for grievances against police brutality.
We requested, for instance, a police or a civilian review board, and that again, no commitment was made.
Which is a thing that's still actively being fought for. In Chicago. Like, today. Right now. And politicians are always constantly talking down to activists about how unrealistic and silly this idea is. But apparently Martin Luther King thought it was worth something 50 years ago. And Chicago really needs it, you guys. Oh my god. I kind of get why they omitted King's later career. You've got a limited amount of time, you want to play the hits. But the removal of some of King's most radical positions, combined with the modern post-racial world presented in the film, really makes it seem like King achieved everything he set out to do. Makes it seem like the work is done. Which, as many have said, we have a long way to go. The other major issue with the film is the way it presents King's role within the civil rights movement. Now, before I start this section, I want to be clear. I am not minimizing King's role within the civil rights movement. He did incredibly crucial work, inspired countless people, and put all of himself into the cause. He was a radical, an orator, and one hell of a good organizer. But he was also only one organizer. This movie kind of paints him as the only one in the movement who mattered. The movie downplays fellow activists a bit.
A woman named Rosa Parks was tired and refused to give up her seat on the back of the bus to a white person. They threw her in jail because there's a city ordinance which says that a Negro has to give up his or her seat if a white person wants it.
Most importantly, in this movie, without King, the entire civil rights movement does not happen. And apparently not just that, without him, no liberation struggles happen. Women's rights go up in smoke too. And especially with the magic and the talk about destiny, it makes it seem like the whole civil rights movement hinged on just this one man, like he's some kind of otherworldly hero. Now, I don't think this was the intention. In fact, the intention was the opposite. They wanted this film to convey that anyone could change the world, that one person could make a difference.
But how can one person's life cause so much change?
But this was the thing I remembered most about the movie. Well, I mean, aside from the skateboarding, of course.
It must be because of me. Because I left my own time, things have changed in your time.
You mean all the good you did in the 50s and 60s? The marches, the boycotts? Doesn't exist anymore?
Maybe the work I was supposed to do never happened. Because I wasn't there to do it.
As a kid, I came away from this thinking, without Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement would never have happened. Not I could change the future, not anyone can change the future, but this man, this one person was able to change things because he was special, because he was great. It almost ends up falling a bit in line with the great man of history school of thought. So there are some competing theories about what makes history happen, about what drives world events. The great man theory of history was first put forth by historian/writer/general pretentious thinker type Thomas Carlyle in the 1840s. He said that the history of the world is but the biography of great men, and believed that these special once-in-a-generation figures changed the world through personal attributes and divine inspiration. Those who support this theory say leaders are born with the attributes necessary to set them apart from those around them, and that these traits enable them to assume roles of authority and power. These great leaders are heroes, almost in the old-fashioned Greek mythology sense of the word. Like if you read Carlyle, he describes these leaders in mystical, magical terms as almost divine. This was a popular theory of history for a long time. Some encyclopedias were reworked to be more focused on biographies of great leaders. Curriculums were often designed around teaching students about these important individuals. The theory fell out of favor after World War II. Of course, there's always somebody trying to bring this school of thought back. And you could argue that in the US, we never really fell out of love with this theory of history, given that we often regard our founding fathers as the most important special guys who ever lived. This theory influenced thinking about the American story as we were becoming a world power, and the effects of this still linger. We love thinking about history as a grand narrative, as a movie, and larger-than-life heroes play into that urge. And this theory not only affected the way we think about history, and the way we think about historical figures, it also affected our storytelling. I don't know if you've noticed, but pretty much our entire popular culture has been dedicated to the idea of great men for, well, kind of a while now. One of the major flaws in this theory is it doesn't account for what large groups of people, what movements, can achieve when working together. The main counter to the great man theory of history is people's history, or history from below. This theory has a focus on the masses, the disenfranchised. It talks about how the world is affected and changed by all of the people who live on it, not just a couple of great men. Or, to put it another way, the history of all existing society is the history of class struggles. The civil rights movement is an ultimate example of history of the people, of millions of disenfranchised people working together to challenge white supremacist power structures and fight for their rights. This is something King himself was very aware of. He knew he was one part of a much larger movement. Again, I don't think our friend Martin intended to make King the only important member of the civil rights movement. When the movie was released, Dexter King, Martin Luther King's son, hoped that people would take from this film that his father was an ordinary man like any other. He hoped people would understand that anyone could do what his father had done. I hope that viewers will get from it the message that one person can make a difference. I think most people saw my father, and still do, from a historical perspective, the superficial part of his legacy, versus the way that any kid can say, I can be like him, I can do that. The film is trying to make Martin Luther King relatable, just another kid in the neighborhood that you can play baseball with, and suggests that the kids he meets could change the world too.
Well, actually probably not Randy, let's be honest here.
Even the title is written to put him on the same level as the modern kids he meets. He's just our friend, Martin.
But for one, this is a bit undermined by the whole magic and grand destiny thing. The mystery of the museum, the way he transforms into a grander version of himself before our eyes, even his choice to go back to the past, despite suspecting something bad might happen to him.
There's something I didn't tell you. If you go back...
No. Please don't tell me anymore. Am I right?
Right.
This all makes him into a grand figure, a great man. Very much a mythological hero.
But it's not individuals that make change, it's people, movements working together. The civil rights movement was able to do a lot of good work because huge numbers of people worked together. The idea of heroes, of great men, is often comforting. When things are hard, it can be appealing to think that someone special is going to swoop in and fix everything. But that's not borne out by history. No one can change the world alone. King didn't change the world alone. But you can change things if you practice solidarity, if you reach out to those around you.
Our friend Martin is being incredibly genuine. It is trying to teach students that they can make a difference in the world too. It just ends up getting caught in some of the American storytelling standards and conventions that emphasize lone heroes. We Americans do love our chosen ones and our grand destinies. The movie ends up playing into some comforting myths. That America is mostly past racism, that the work King started is pretty much complete, and that in horrible times, it's great heroes who will come to save us. This is common, especially when dealing with history in children's media. There's always a temptation to soften the blow for kids. But impressions gained as children can be maintained as adults. And that can play into the idea that either everything is okay, or that it's not, but we can't change anything because we're not special, so why bother? This can breed disengagement, which can be really dangerous. After all, there are people in the world who would genuinely rather remember King as a one-off, as one special person who brought greatness into the world, rather than recognize he was backed by a movement, that there are modern MLKs today. It's easier and more convenient for many people to make a sanitized version of a man who's been dead for half a century into a hero than to support a living, breathing movement. And there are many people who would love to forget the beliefs of kings that they find inconvenient. Remembering King and the movement as they were, and not as the myths our culture has made of them, is vital to fighting racism today.
Politicians can't say they love Dr. King and how he stood for love and unity, but then you deny and refuse to support his agenda. Right, Governor?
Our friend Martin is still a very good introduction to the civil rights movement. There are not nearly enough movies about these struggles, especially for kids. And despite its flaws, it's clearly still very interested in getting kids involved. If you can convince modern kids to watch a 1990s period piece, it's not a bad place to start a conversation. But while this is a good intro to King and the civil rights movement as a whole, this movie can't be the end of the conversation. Yet unfortunately for too many people, this is about where the conversation ends. Hell, a decent chunk of people don't even get this far. What we really need is updates of this story. We need new ways to teach people about King and the civil rights movement, about all of its different dimensions. So remember the life of King, remember what he was fighting for. And also remember the movement, the thousands of ordinary people with different tactics and ideas and perspectives. Because it was all of them, working together in solidarity, that made things happen. And it will be all of us working together that leads to change now. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. I'm putting this outro over the lovely Our Friend Martin finale montage, which features lots and lots of stock footage and is somehow the weirdest part of the movie. Thank you all for watching a review of an educational film that many of you are probably too young to remember. I really appreciate it. I meant to get this video out about 2 weeks ago for Martin Luther King Day, but I am very behind on my schedule for these videos. Someday, I promise, I will release a video on time. Thank you to everyone who became a patron on Patreon for my first month there. If you want to donate, I've got a link in the description. I've also got a Ko-Fi, Coffee, whatever it's called, if you want to do a one-time donation. However, for this video, since I mentioned some of their work, I thought instead of donating to me, you could donate to the Chicago Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression. They're the organization putting forward the idea of the Civilian Police Accountability Council in Chicago, which is something Chicago desperately needs. I also added some links to a few other organizations doing related work in the description. Also in the description, I've got a bunch of links to videos I mentioned you should watch, or other cool videos I came across while doing research. Check them out if you'd like. Thanks again for watching, and see you soon!